In a prestigious Upper West Side apartment, a 72-year-old retired professor was about to face the ultimate betrayal. What started as a peaceful book club discussion took a shocking turn when she came face to face with her own children's calculated scheme. Clarita Morrison wasn't your typical vulnerable senior. For 4 decades, she had shaped minds as a Columbia University professor, known for her razor-sharp intellect. When she encountered her daughter's manipulative accusations about incompetence, she had no idea she was walking into a plan to steal her freedom. Clarita's fight back would lead to an unexpected romance and courtroom battle that proved love and justice bloom at any age. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Clarita Morrison's Upper West Side apartment, casting warm shadows across the Persian rug where her book club had gathered in their familiar circle. The room held the comfortable elegance of a lifetime academic. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, their spines creating a tapestry of knowledge accumulated over decades of teaching English literature at Columbia University. "The thing about Woolf," Clarita said, adjusting her reading glasses as she held up her well-worn copy of Mrs. Dalloway, "is that she understood how memory can ambush us, how the past isn't really past at all. It lives in every moment, waiting to surface." Rose Anderson, her closest friend and fellow widow, nodded thoughtfully from the burgundy armchair that had become her designated spot over the years. Clarice's walk through London, seeing her old lover Peter, it's devastating in its honesty. The way regret can crystallize in a single encounter. The other 3 members of their monthly gathering murmured agreement. Eleanor Chen, a retired psychiatrist, leaned forward with her characteristic intensity. But there's also liberation in those moments of recognition. When Clarissa finally understands what she's chosen, what she's given up, what she's gained. Clarita smiled, feeling the familiar warmth that came from intellectual discourse among equals. At 72, she'd lost many things. Her beloved husband Robert 5 years ago, her teaching position to mandatory retirement, even some of her physical stamina. But her mind remained sharp as ever, perhaps sharper for having been honed by law. "You know," she said, setting down her teacup with the careful precision that had become second nature since a minor hand tremor developed the previous year. "I've been rereading Woolf's essay on growing older." She wrote about how society expects women to simply fade away after a certain age, to become invisible. But the inner life, the real life, continues to grow more complex, more nuanced. "Exactly," Rose said with the fierce loyalty that had characterized their friendship since they'd met at a grief counseling group years earlier. "Just because we're not 25 doesn't mean we've stopped evolving." The conversation might have continued in this comfortable vein. It usually did, but the sound of keys jingling outside the apartment door cut through the literary discussion. Clarita frowned slightly. She wasn't expecting anyone, and her children rarely visited without calling first. Margaret's voice carried through the hallway, artificially bright in a way that immediately put Clarita on alert. Her daughter appeared in the living room doorway, her perfectly styled blonde hair and expensive suit suggesting she'd come directly from her marketing firm in Midtown. Behind her lurked James, hands shoved deep in his paint-stained jacket pockets, his expression unreadable. "Margaret, James." Clarita rose from her chair with the grace of someone who'd spent decades commanding classrooms. "I wasn't expecting you. We're in the middle of book club." "Oh, I'm so sorry." Margaret's eyes swept the room, taking in the assembled women with what appeared to be genuine embarrassment, but felt calculated to Clarita's experienced eye. "I completely forgot about your little reading group. James and I were just in the neighborhood, and thought we'd check on you." The phrase "little reading group" rankled, but Clarita kept her expression neutral. "Ladies, this is my daughter Margaret and my son James." "Margaret, James, you remember Rose, of course, and Eleanor, and these are Patricia and Anne." The women exchanged polite greetings, but Clarita noticed how Margaret's smile seemed to catalog each face, as if memorizing potential witnesses to something. The thought was absurd, yet it lingered. "We were just discussing Virginia Woolf," Rose said, her voice carrying a subtle edge, that suggested she'd picked up on the same subtle wrongness that Clarita sensed. Your mother was sharing some fascinating insights about memory and aging. Oh, Mom's always been brilliant with books, Margaret replied, though her tone suggested this brilliance might be more nostalgic than current. Though lately I've been a little worried about her memory. Haven't I mentioned it to you, James shifted uncomfortably, his artist's hands fidgeting with a loose thread on his jacket. I don't know if worried is the right word. Just last week, Margaret continued, ignoring her brother's weak protest. I called to check on her and she seemed confused about what day it was. And when I stopped by Tuesday, or was it Wednesday, I found a pot on the stove that had been burning for who knows how long. Clarita's eyes sharpened. She remembered no such incident, and Margaret certainly hadn't visited on Tuesday or Wednesday of the previous week. I don't recall. And the bills piling up on the kitchen counter, Margaret pressed on, her voice taking on a concerned daughter's cadence that felt rehearsed. The electric company notice, the credit card statements. I know managing finances can become overwhelming at our age. My age, Clarita corrected quietly, but her mind was racing. There had been no electric company notice, no overdue bills. She'd always been meticulous about her finances, a necessity learned from her years as a single mother after her first husband abandoned them when the children were young. Rose cleared her throat pointedly. Well, we should probably wrap up for today. Clarita, thank you for hosting as always. Same time next month. The other women took the hint, gathering their books and purses with the efficiency of people who'd rather not witness a family drama. Eleanor squeezed Clarita's shoulder on her way out. Call me if you need anything, she said quietly, her psychiatric training evidently picking up on undercurrents the others might miss. Within minutes, the apartment had emptied of all but family. The silence felt heavy, loaded with unspoken tensions. Mom, James began, then stopped, glancing at his sister for guidance. We're worried about you living alone in this big apartment, Margaret said, settling onto the sofa without invitation. It's a lot to manage, and you're not getting any younger. Clarita remained standing, drawing on the authority that had served her well in academic settings. I'm managing perfectly well, thank you. I've lived in this apartment for 15 years, since your father and I bought it after his promotion to full professor. But that was when Dad was alive to help, Margaret said, her voice softening with what might have been genuine emotion. Now you're alone, and accidents happen. What if you'd been hurt when that pot was burning? What if no one had found you? What pot? Clarita asked sharply. Margaret, I have no memory of any such incident, because it didn't happen. Margaret exchanged a look with James that Clarita caught and filed away for later analysis. Mom, that's exactly what worries us. Memory can be tricky at our age. The deliberate correction hung in the air between them. Clarita felt something cold settle in her chest. A recognition that this conversation was following a script she hadn't been given. I think, she said carefully, that perhaps we should continue this discussion another time. It's been a long day. Of course, Margaret said, rising with apparent reluctance. But Mom, I want you to promise me you'll think about what we've said. Maybe we could look at some nice assisted living places together. Just to see what's available. James finally spoke up. Margaret, maybe we should. Should what? Margaret's voice carried a sharp edge before she modulated it back to concern. Should ignore the sign. Should wait until something terrible happens. After they left, Clarita stood alone in her living room, surrounded by the familiar comfort of her books, but feeling suddenly uncertain. The apartment seemed different somehow, as if Margaret's words had cast shadows where none had existed before. She walked to the kitchen, checking the stove out of habit rather than concern. All burners were off, as they always were when she wasn't cooking. She opened the drawer where she kept her bills and found them neatly organized and up to date as always. But doubt was insidious, she realized. Even knowing Margaret was wrong, part of her mind began questioning itself. Had there been a moment when she'd left something on the stove? A bill she'd overlooked? The phone rang, startling her from these troubling thoughts. Ms. Morris, this is David Johnson returning your call about estate planning consultation. The voice was warm, professional, with an undertone of genuine interest that immediately put her at ease. She remembered now. She'd called his office earlier in the week after reading an article about elder law in the Times. "Yes, Mr. Johnson, thank you for calling back. I was hoping to schedule a consultation to review my will and financial arrangements." "Of course. Is this something urgent or standard planning?" Clarita hesitated, Margaret's words still echoing in her mind. "I'm not sure," she said honestly. "Perhaps we could discuss that when we meet." "Absolutely. Would next Tuesday afternoon work for you? Say 2 o'clock. As she wrote the appointment in her leather-bound planner, the same one she'd used for decades to track classes, conferences, and committee meetings, Clarita felt a small measure of her equilibrium returning. Whatever game Margaret was playing, whatever concerns were real or manufactured, she wouldn't face them unprepared. But as she prepared for bed that night, she found herself double-checking the stove, the locks, the lights with unusual attention. And when she caught herself doing it, she felt a flash of anger that surprised her with its intensity. She paused before her bedroom mirror, seeing a woman who looked younger than her 72 years. Silver hair still thick and well-styled, blue eyes still sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. The face looking back at her was thoughtful, determined, perhaps a little wary now. "You're not going anywhere," she told her reflection quietly. Not without a fight. Outside her windows, Manhattan continued its restless dance of lights and movement, indifferent to the small drama playing out in one Upper West Side apartment. But Clarita Morrison, retired professor of English literature, had spent her life understanding the power of narrative, and she was beginning to suspect that someone was trying to write her story for her. The only question was whether she would let them. Clarita's hand trembled slightly as she pressed the elevator button for the 32nd floor of the glass tower on East 4th. The tremor wasn't from nervousness. It was the same minor shake that had developed over the past year, a reminder that her body was aging even if her mind remained sharp. She'd researched David Johnson's law firm thoroughly before making the appointment, finding a practice that specialized in elder law with an impressive track record of protecting seniors' rights. The elevator doors opened to reveal a reception area that struck the perfect balance between professional competence and personal warmth. Rich mahogany furniture was softened by family photographs and artwork that suggested the lawyers here saw their clients as people, not just billable hours. A young woman with kind eyes and an efficient manner greeted her from behind the reception desk. "Ms. Morrison, I'm Sarah Mitchell, Mr. Johnson's associate. He's just finishing up a call, but he'll be right with you. Can I get you some coffee or tea?" "Tea would be lovely, thank you." Clarita settled into a comfortable chair, noting how Sarah's warm professionalism reminded her of her best graduate students. Intelligent, eager, with an underlying passion for their work that couldn't be faked. As Sarah prepared the tea, she glanced over with obvious curiosity. "Johnson mentioned, you're a retired professor, Columbia, wasn't it? My grandmother always said the best teachers never really retire. They just find new students." Before Clarita could respond, a door opened down the hallway and David Johnson emerged. At 58, he moved with the quiet confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. His graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses gave him a scholarly appearance that immediately put Clarita at ease. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. Warm brown eyes that seemed to actually see her, not just her age. "Ms. Morrison, thank you for coming in." His handshake was firm without being overpowering, respectful without being condescending. "Please come back to my office. Sarah, would you mind bringing Ms. Morrison's tea when it's ready?" David's office reflected the same thoughtful balance as the reception area. Legal volumes lined custom shelves, but personal touches softened the space. A small collection of classical music CDs, a photograph of what appeared to be a hiking trip, and several framed thank you letters from clients. He gestured to a seating area with 2 comfortable chairs rather than positioning himself behind his imposing desk. "So," he said, settling into his chair with a slight smile, "you mentioned on the phone that you're interested in estate planning, but I sensed there might be more to it than routine maintenance. Clarita found herself studying his face as she considered how much to reveal. His expression was patient, encouraging without being pushy. She'd spent decades reading people. Students trying to bluff their way through unprepared presentations, colleagues with hidden agendas, administrators who spoke in careful euphemisms. David Johnson's face suggested someone who genuinely cared about the answer to his question. "You're very perceptive, Mr. Johnson. Yes, there are some family dynamics that have me concerned. Please, call me David. And would you mind if I ask what specifically has you worried?" Sarah appeared with the tea, placing it on the small table between them before quietly withdrawing. Clarita wrapped her hands around the warm cup, finding comfort in the familiar ritual. "My children visited me yesterday," she began carefully. "My daughter, Margaret, made some claims about incidents I don't remember, pots left burning on the stove, unpaid bills, confusion about dates. She suggested I might be developing memory problems and should consider assisted living." David's expression didn't change, but she noticed how his attention sharpened. "And you don't recall these incidents? Not only do I not recall them, I'm quite certain they never happened. I've always been meticulous about my finances and household management. It's a necessity when you've been a single mother, as I was for several years after my first husband left." "I see." David leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled in thought. "Can you tell me about your current living situation? Are you managing well independently?" For the next 20 minutes, Clarita found herself describing her daily routine, her financial management, her social connections, her health status. David listened with the kind of focused attention she remembered from her best academic colleagues, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated he was not just hearing, but understanding. "You mentioned your daughter specifically. What about your son's involvement in this conversation?" Clarita hesitated. James was there, but he seemed uncomfortable, almost like he was following a script he didn't believe in. David made a note on his legal pad. "Morrison, Clarita, what I'm going to tell you may be difficult to hear, but in my experience, when adult children suddenly begin expressing concerns about a parent's competency, especially concerns that seem exaggerated or unfounded, there are often underlying financial motivations." The words hung in the air between them. Clarita felt her stomach tighten, but also experienced a strange relief. Someone was finally acknowledging what her instincts had been telling her. "You think this is about money? I think it's about control, which often amounts to the same thing. Can you tell me about your financial situation? Generally speaking, I'm not asking for specific numbers yet." Clarita described her assets: the Manhattan apartment she and Robert had purchased, her teacher's pension, Robert's life insurance, and a modest but comfortable investment portfolio. As she spoke, she watched David's expression grow more serious. "That's a substantial estate," he said quietly. "Have you done any recent estate planning? Updated your will since your husband's death?" "Not recently. Everything was set up when Robert was alive, with the children as primary beneficiaries. I suppose I should review it, but it seemed adequate." David nodded thoughtfully. "In my experience, family members who are concerned about an elderly relative's welfare typically want to ensure that person gets the best possible care while maintaining their independence as long as possible. They don't usually jump straight to suggestions about assisted living unless there's been a significant incident or medical diagnosis. There's been neither. Which brings me to my next question, and please forgive me if this sounds blunt. What would happen to your assets if you were declared incompetent and placed in managed care?" The question hit her like a physical blow. I suppose Margaret and James would have to manage my affairs. As your power of attorney, they would indeed have control over your finances. They could make decisions about your care, your living arrangements, even the sale of your apartment to pay for that care." Clarita set down her teacup with a sharp clink. "You're suggesting my own children would manipulate me into a nursing home to get access to my money?" David's voice remained gentle but firm. "I'm suggesting that in cases like this, it's wise to protect yourself legally before the situation escalates. Have you considered updating your estate documents to include more specific protections?" Before she could answer, Sarah appeared in the doorway. "David, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you have an urgent call from Thomas Bradley's office about the Henderson case. David's expression darkened slightly. Tell them I'll call back in an hour. He said it was about a motion being filed this afternoon. Something about new evidence of incompetency. Clarita watched this exchange with growing unease. Is something wrong? David looked back at her, his professional mask slipping slightly to reveal genuine concern. Thomas Bradley is an attorney who specializes in contested guardianship cases. He's aggressive in his tactics and not particularly scrupulous about the methods he uses to prove his cases. The words sent a chill through Clarita. Guardianship cases? Situations where family members petition the court to declare an elderly relative incompetent and place them under legal guardianship. It removes the person's right to make their own decisions about finances, healthcare, living arrangements, essentially everything. Clarita felt the room spinning slightly. Could she? Let me ask you this, David said carefully. Did your daughter take any photographs during her visit yesterday? Did she document anything about your apartment, your condition, your behavior? The memory hit her like ice water. Margaret had indeed taken out her phone several times, claiming to show Clarita pictures of her grandchildren. But now, thinking back, Clarita realized her daughter had been angling the camera toward the kitchen, the living room, even Clarita herself. Yes, she whispered. She was photographing things. I thought she was showing me pictures. But, David's jaw tightened. Clarita, I think we need to move quickly. If Thomas Bradley is involved, it means someone is preparing to file for emergency guardianship. Once that petition is filed, you'll be forced to prove your competency in court rather than simply living your life. What do I do? First, we're going to update your estate documents immediately. We'll include specific provisions that make it much harder for anyone to claim you're incompetent. Second, we're going to document your current mental state with medical professionals. And third, we're going to prepare for the possibility that this becomes a legal battle. Sarah reappeared with a thick file folder. David, I pulled the Bradley cases from the past 2 years. The pattern is always the same. Sudden claims of incompetency, staged evidence, emergency petitions filed within days of the initial family intervention. David opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. Look at this, he said, showing Clarita a case summary. Elderly widower, substantial assets, adult children claiming he was confused and unsafe. Bradley got an emergency guardianship order based on photographs of a messy apartment and testimony about concerning behavior. The man lost his home, his independence and control of his finances within 2 weeks. Clarita's hands were shaking now, but not from age. How is that legal? Because the system is designed to protect vulnerable seniors, which is admirable in principle. But it can be exploited by people who understand how to manipulate the process. David's voice carried years of frustration. I've spent my career fighting these cases, trying to protect people's right to age with dignity. Why? Clarita asked, surprising herself with the personal question. David's expression softened. My grandmother, she was sharp as a tack until the day she died at 93. But my uncle convinced a court she was incompetent because she refused to sell her house and move to Florida with him. She spent her last 2 years in a nursing home she hated, while he sold everything she'd worked for her entire life. The pain in his voice was real, personal. Clarita felt something shift between them. This wasn't just professional anymore. I won't let that happen to you, David continued. But I need you to understand what we're up against. If Margaret has already contacted Thomas Bradley, if she's documenting evidence and building a case, we're in a race against time. Clarita straightened in her chair, drawing on the strength that had carried her through decades of academic challenges, through raising 2 children alone, through the grief of losing Robert. Then we'd better get started. David smiled for the first time since Sarah's interruption, and Clarita found herself noticing how it transformed his entire face. That's the spirit. Sarah, clear my calendar for the rest of the afternoon. We have work to do. As Sarah bustled out to rearrange appointments, David moved to his desk and pulled out a fresh legal pad. Let's start with your medical history and current cognitive status. We're going to document everything: your memory, your decision-making abilities, your daily function. By the time we're done, you'll have more proof of your competency than any court could require. But even as Clarita began answering his questions, even as she felt the relief of having a champion in her corner, a part of her mind kept circling back to Margaret's performance the day before. The calculated concern, the staged photographs, the way she'd planted seeds of doubt with such practiced ease. Her own daughter was preparing to destroy her life for money. The thought was almost incomprehensible, yet the evidence was becoming undeniable. "David," she said quietly, interrupting his questions about her daily routine, "when this goes to court, and I assume it will, how ugly is it going to get?" His pen paused on the paper. "Honestly, these cases can be brutal. Thomas Bradley will attack your character, your judgment, your relationships. He'll take every minor memory lapse, every moment of normal human confusion, and twist it into evidence of incompetency. And if we lose, then you lose everything. Your home, your independence, your right to make your own choices. They could place you in whatever facility they choose, sell your apartment, control every aspect of your life." Clarita absorbed this information with the same calm she'd once brought to analyzing difficult knitter texts. The stakes were clear, the enemy was identified, the battle lines were drawn. "In that case," she said with a slight smile that reminded David of his most formidable law professors, "we'd better make sure we win." The grandfather clock in Clarita's hallway chimed 3 in the morning, when the pounding on her door shattered the silence of her peaceful apartment. She'd been deeply asleep, dreaming of her classroom at Columbia, when the violent sound jerked her awake with a start that left her heart racing. "Police! Open up!" Clarita fumbled for her robe, her mind struggling to process what was happening. The pounding continued, urgent and demanding. Through the peephole she could see 2 uniformed officers in the hallway, their faces grim under the harsh fluorescent lighting. "Ma'am, we need you to open the door. We've received a call about a welfare check." With trembling fingers, Clarita undid the chain lock and opened the door. The officers, one young and clearly uncomfortable, the other older with the weary expression of someone who'd seen too much, stepped into her foyer without waiting for an invitation. "Are you Clarita Morrison?" the older officer asked, his voice carrying the bureaucratic tone of someone following procedure.
"Yes, I am."
"What's this about?" "It's 3 in the morning. We received a call from your daughter Margaret Morrison Thompson. She was concerned about your welfare, said she found you wandering the hallway in your nightgown, confused and disoriented." Clarita's blood ran cold. "That's absolutely false. I've been asleep in my bed for hours. I haven't left this apartment since yesterday evening." The younger officer glanced around the apartment, taking in the elegant furnishings, the well-organized bookshelves, the clear signs of a competent, independent lifestyle. His partner, however, seemed more focused on Clarita herself, her rumpled nightgown, her sleep-tousled hair, the natural disorientation of someone awakened at 3 in the morning. "Ma'am, your daughter seemed very concerned. She said this has been happening more frequently, you getting confused about where you are, what time it is." "My daughter is lying." The words came out sharper than Clarita intended, but she was beyond caring about diplomacy. "I was not wandering anywhere. I was in my bed, asleep." The officers exchanged a look that made Clarita's stomach clench. She could see them processing her appearance, her obvious agitation, the way her words might sound to someone predisposed to see an elderly woman in crisis. "Ma'am, we understand you're upset," the older officer said in a tone one might use with a confused child. "But we need to make sure you're safe. Your daughter mentioned you might be having some memory issues." "I am not having memory issues." Clarita's voice rose, and she immediately regretted it. Shouting at police officers at 3 in the morning, while wearing a nightgown, was exactly the kind of behavior that would be twisted into evidence of instability. "Mom," the voice from the hallway made Clarita's blood freeze. Margaret appeared in the doorway, perfectly dressed despite the early hour, her face a mask of concerned daughter performing for an audience. Behind her, James hovered like a guilty shadow. "Thank goodness you found her," Margaret said to the officers, her voice trembling with what sounded like relief. "I was so worried when I saw her in the hallway. She seemed so confused, didn't even recognize me at first." "That is a complete fabrication," Clarita said, her voice deadly quiet. "Margaret, how did you even get into this building at 3 in the morning?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I have a key, Mom. Remember, you gave it to me for emergencies. Margaret held up a key that Clarita definitely did not remember giving her. When I couldn't sleep, I decided to check on you. I've been so worried since our conversation yesterday. The pieces of the trap were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Margaret had somehow obtained a key, probably made a copy during one of her visits. She'd waited until the dead of night to stage this scene, counting on Clarita being disoriented from sleep, on the police seeing an elderly woman in distress rather than a competent person being manipulated. Officers, Clarita said, drawing on every ounce of authority she'd ever possessed in a classroom, I need you to understand that this is not what it appears to be. My daughter has been making false claims about my mental state, and I believe this is a deliberate attempt to create documentation for a legal proceeding. The younger officer looked uncomfortable, but his partner's expression remained skeptical. Ma'am, false emergency calls are a serious matter. Are you saying your daughter is lying about finding you in the hallway? I am saying exactly that. Margaret's face crumpled with what appeared to be genuine distress. Mom, please, you were in the hallway in your nightgown. You asked me who I was. You seemed so confused about where you were. Margaret, I know this is hard for you to admit, Margaret continued, her voice breaking slightly. Memory loss is frightening, but denying it won't make it go away. James finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe we should call Dr. Williams. She could. That's actually not a bad idea, the older officer interrupted. A medical evaluation might be helpful here. Clarita felt the walls closing in around her. Every word she spoke in her own defense could be twisted into evidence of agitation or confusion. Every protest could be seen as denial. Margaret had orchestrated this beautifully, creating a scenario where Clarita's very competence would be seen as incompetence. I'll call Dr. Williams, Margaret said quickly, already reaching for her phone. She's been Mom's doctor for years. She'll know what to do. As Margaret stepped into the hallway to make the call, James moved closer to his mother. For a moment his mask slipped and Clarita saw genuine anguish in his eyes. Mom, he whispered, so quietly only she could hear. I'm sorry, I never wanted. Step away from her, please, the older officer instructed. We need to make sure she's not agitated further. The irony was bitter. They were protecting her from her own son's apology, while enabling her daughter's calculated destruction. 20 minutes later, Patricia Williams arrived, her usually immaculate appearance, slightly disheveled from the emergency call. At 55, she'd been practicing geriatric medicine long enough to recognize family dynamics that went beyond medical concern. Patricia, Clarita said with relief as her longtime physician entered the apartment. Thank goodness you're here. This is all a misunderstanding. Dr. Williams took in the scene, the police officers, Margaret's tear-stained face, James's obvious discomfort, and Clarita's controlled fear. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but Clarita caught a flicker of something that might have been recognition. Let me examine my patient, Dr. Williams said firmly. Officers, I'll need some privacy for the medical evaluation. Of course, Doc. We'll be right outside if you need anything. Once they were alone, Dr. Williams's demeanor shifted subtly. Clarita, tell me exactly what happened tonight. In low, urgent tones, Clarita explained the evening's events. Dr. Williams listened without interruption, her trained eye taking in Clarita's coherent narrative, her clear recollection of details, her obvious anger at being manipulated rather than confusion about events. Your daughter claims you were confused and disoriented when she found you, Dr. Williams said. Is there any possibility? Patricia, you've been my doctor for over a decade. Have I ever shown any signs of dementia or confusion during our appointments? No, you haven't. Your cognitive function has always been excellent. Dr. Williams was quiet for a moment, considering. Clarita, this feels less like a medical emergency and more like a family dispute with legal implications. That's exactly what it is. I believe Margaret is building a case to have me declared incompetent. Dr. Williams's jaw tightened. She'd seen this scenario before. Family members manufacturing medical crises to support guardianship petitions. It was one of the most disturbing trends in elder care, and she'd testified against it more than once. I'm going to conduct a full cognitive assessment, she said. Standard protocol for these situations, but I want you to know that based on my examination and your presentation tonight, I see no evidence of cognitive impairment or confusion. The assessment took 30 minutes. Dr. Williams tested Clarita's memory, orientation, problem-solving abilities, and emotional regulation. Clarita answered every question correctly, demonstrated perfect recall of recent events, and showed no signs of the disorientation that would be expected if Margaret's story were true. When they rejoined the others, Dr. Williams's report was clinical and precise. Mrs. Morrison shows no signs of cognitive impairment, confusion, or disorientation. Her mental status is entirely within normal limits for her age. She demonstrates excellent recall of recent events and clear understanding of her circumstances. Margaret's face went pale. But doctor, what about what I saw in the hallway? The confusion, the way she didn't recognize me. I can only report on what I observed during my examination. Williams replied diplomatically, and what I observe is a mentally competent woman who has been awakened from sleep by a police welfare check. The older officer looked between Dr. Williams and Margaret, clearly trying to reconcile conflicting accounts. So there's no medical emergency here. No medical emergency, Dr. Williams confirmed. Mrs. Morrison is fully capable of caring for herself and making her own decisions. After the police left and Dr. Williams departed with a meaningful look that promised they would talk soon, Clarita found herself alone with her children in the apartment that suddenly felt violated. "Mom," Margaret began, but Clarita cut her off. "Get out. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." Clarita's voice carried the ice-cold authority that had once made graduate students tremble. "You orchestrated this entire scene. You obtained a key to my apartment without my permission, you lied to the police about finding me in the hallway, and you're building a false case to have me declared incompetent." James stepped forward, his face crumpled with guilt. "Mom, I tried to tell her not to. But you didn't stop her, did you?" Clarita's eyes were hard as she looked at her son. "You stood there and let her lie to the police about your own mother. The inheritance." James started, then stopped, realizing what he'd almost admitted. Clarita nodded slowly. "There it is, the truth finally comes out." Margaret's mask finally slipped completely. "You can't live alone forever, Mom. You're 72 years old. What happens when you have a real emergency? What happens when you actually do start losing your memory? When and if that happens, I'll deal with it appropriately. But I will not be manipulated into giving up my independence by my own children for financial gain. This isn't about money. Everything about this is about money." Clarita moved to her front door and opened it. "Leave. Now. And Margaret, don't ever use that key again. I'll be changing the locks tomorrow." After they left, Clarita stood in her living room shaking with adrenaline and fury. The elegant space that had been her sanctuary now felt contaminated by the evening's event. She could see how every item might be photographed and misconstrued. A stack of books could become evidence of clutter. A coffee cup left on a table could suggest poor housekeeping. Her own shock and anger could be twisted into confusion and agitation. She walked to her kitchen and made herself a cup of tea with hands that were steadier than she'd expected. As she waited for the water to boil, she reached for her phone and called David Johnson's emergency number. "David, it's Clarita Morrison. I'm sorry to call so late, but something's happened. Margaret just staged an incident with the police. I think she's moving faster than we anticipated." His voice was immediately alert, professional. "Are you safe? Are the police still there?" "I'm safe. The police are gone, and Dr. Williams examined me and found no cognitive issue. But David, they're not waiting. Margaret had a key to my apartment. I never gave her. She lied to the police about finding me confused in the hallway. She's building her case. I'll be right over." "It's 4 a.m, Clarita. If they're moving this aggressively, we don't have time to waste. I'm on my way." As she hung up the phone, Clarita felt a grim satisfaction settle over her shock and anger. Margaret had overplayed her hand. In her eagerness to create evidence of incompetence, She'd created evidence of manipulation instead. Dr. Williams had witnessed the whole charade, and her medical opinion would carry significant weight in any legal proceeding. But she also knew this was just the beginning. Margaret wouldn't give up after one failed attempt. If anything, tonight's failure would make her more desperate, more willing to escalate her tactics. The battle for Clarita's independence had officially begun, and her own daughter had just declared war. But Clarita Morrison had spent her life teaching students to think critically, to question narratives, to recognize manipulation when they saw it. She would not go quietly into anyone's nursing home. The apartment was silent again, but it was no longer the peaceful silence of home. It was the tense quiet before a storm, and Clarita knew that by morning, everything would be different. David Johnson's law office had transformed overnight into something resembling a military command center. When Clarita arrived at 8 in the morning, still shaken from the previous night's ordeal, she found Sarah Mitchell surrounded by legal documents, case files, and what appeared to be a timeline drawn on a large whiteboard. "I've been here since 5, Sarah explained, gesturing to the organized chaos around her. "After David called me about last night's incident, I knew we needed to move fast, and I was right. This arrived by courier an hour ago." She handed Clarita a thick legal document with the official seal of Manhattan Family Court. The words at the top made her blood run cold. Emergency petition for guardianship and protective service. David emerged from his office, his usually calm demeanor replaced by the focused intensity of a lawyer preparing for battle. "They filed it at 6 this morning, claiming immediate danger to your welfare based on last night's incident. Thomas Bradley's nothing if not official." Clarita sank into one of the conference room chairs, the legal document heavy in her hands. "How is this possible?" "Dr. Williams found me completely competent." "Because the petition isn't based on Dr. Williams's assessment," David said grimly, pulling up a chair beside her. "It's based on Margaret's sworn statement about finding you confused and disoriented, the police report documenting a welfare check, and what Bradley calls a pattern of concerning behavior indicating cognitive decline." Sarah moved to the whiteboard, where she'd mapped out the timeline of events. "Look at this, Clarita. They've been planning this for weeks, maybe months. Every interaction Margaret had with you, every phone call, every visit, it was all designed to build evidence." The young attorney pointed to different entries on the timeline. "The pot allegedly left on the stove. That creates a safety concern. The bills she claimed were unpaid. Financial mismanagement. Your book club meeting where she interrupted social isolation and resistance to family involvement. Even the phone call about estate planning could be twisted into evidence that you're worried about your own capacity." Clarita studied the timeline with the analytical mind that had served her well in academic research. The pattern was undeniable. Margaret had been methodically constructing a narrative of decline where none existed. "What about James?" she asked. "His statement isn't in the petition." David's expression darkened. "That's actually more troubling. James isn't listed as a petitioner, which suggests Margaret is planning to use him as a witness who will appear reluctant, but truthful. Juries and judges often find reluctant family witnesses more credible. But he was obviously uncomfortable last night. Dr. Williams saw that." "Dr. Williams saw what we saw," Sarah interjected. "But Bradley will argue that James was distressed about having to confront his mother's condition. He'll frame James's discomfort as painful family duty rather than moral conflict." David spread additional documents across the conference table. "Here's what we're facing. The emergency hearing is scheduled for tomorrow at 2 p.m. Bradley is asking for immediate temporary guardianship pending a full competency evaluation. If granted, Margaret would have the authority to make decisions about your living arrangements, medical care, and finances effective immediately." "Tomorrow?" Clarita's voice was sharper than she intended. "How can they move so quickly?" "Emergency guardianship procedures are designed to protect vulnerable adults from immediate harm," Sarah explained. "The irony is that the system Margaret is exploiting was created specifically to help people like you, competent seniors being abused by family members." David opened another file folder. "But we're not going in unprepared. Dr. Williams has agreed to provide expert testimony about your mental status. I've subpoenaed your medical records for the past 5 years. They show no evidence of cognitive decline. And Sarah has been researching Margaret's financial situation. Sarah's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who discovered crucial evidence. This is where it gets interesting. Margaret and her husband are in serious financial trouble. Their Westchester home is in foreclosure proceeding. She has over $60,000 in credit card debt. Her children's private school tuition is 3 months overdue. How did you find all this? Public records, Sarah said with satisfaction. Foreclosure filings, civil judgments, bankruptcy court documents. Margaret Morrison Thompson is drowning financially, and your estate represents her only way out. Clarita felt a complex mixture of emotions, vindication that her suspicions were correct, but also profound sadness that her daughter's desperation had driven her to such extreme. There's more, David continued. I've been investigating Thomas Bradley's other cases. Sarah, show her what you found. Sarah moved to her laptop and pulled up a series of case files. Bradley has filed 14 emergency guardianship petitions in the past 18 months. 12 were successful. The pattern is always the same: sudden family concerns, staged incidents, emergency filings that leave the elderly person no time to prepare an adequate defense. What happened to those people? Most ended up in nursing facilities, their assets liquidated to pay for care. The family members who filed the petitions typically became financial guardians, with significant control over how the money was spent. Sarah's voice carried the indignation of someone who'd chosen elder law to prevent exactly this kind of abuse. David leaned forward, his expression serious. Clarita, I need you to understand what we're up against. Bradley is very good at what he does, and the system is biased toward protecting elderly people even when that protection isn't needed or wanted. Judges would rather err on the side of caution than risk a vulnerable senior being harmed. So what do? We fight back, David said simply, but it's going to be intense, and it's going to be public. Once we're in court, everything about your life becomes evidence. Your financial decisions, your daily routine, your relationships, your past, all of it becomes fair game. Sarah had moved to another section of the whiteboard where she'd outlined their defense strategy. We're going to demonstrate that you're not just competent, but exceptionally so. We need character witnesses, people who can testify to your mental acuity and independent function. Rose Anderson has already agreed to testify, David added. I spoke with her this morning. She's furious about what Margaret is trying to do. Clarita smiled slightly at the thought of Rose's reaction. Her friend had probably used some colorful language that would make a sailor blush. We'll also need your former colleagues from Columbia, Sarah continued. People who've interacted with you recently and can speak to your intellectual capabilities. Dr. Eleanor Chen from the book club is a retired psychiatrist, Clarita offered. She would certainly be able to speak to my mental status. Perfect. The more professional witnesses we have, the better. David made notes on his legal pad. We're also going to need you to undergo a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation with an independent expert. Another doc, a specialist in cognitive assessment who has no relationship with you or your family. Someone whose opinion can't be questioned as biased. David's voice was gentle but firm. I know it feels invasive, but we need to remove any doubt about your mental capacities. Sarah had pulled up another document on her laptop. There's something else we need to discuss. Bradley has filed a motion to have you undergo immediate psychiatric evaluation based on what he calls agitation and resistance to family assistance displayed during last night's incident. Clarita felt her anger flare. My resistance to being manipulated and lied about is evidence of mental illness? In Bradley's hands, it could be, David said grimly. He's very skilled at reframing normal emotional responses as symptoms of cognitive decline. Your anger at being falsely accused becomes paranoia. Your insistence on independence becomes poor judgment. Your refusal to accept Margaret's version of events becomes denial and confusion. The scope of the manipulation was breathtaking. Margaret and Bradley had created a trap where any normal human response to being attacked could be twisted into evidence of incompetence. How do we counter that? By being smarter than they are, Sarah said with fierce determination. We document everything, every interaction, every conversation, every decision you make. We create a record that shows not just competence, but superior functioning. David stood and moved to the window overlooking the Manhattan streets below. Clarita, there's something else we need to discuss. The relationship between attorney and client in a case like this can become very intense. We're going to be working closely together, often under stressful circumstances. If at any point you feel uncomfortable with the level of involvement required, or if you want to bring in additional counsel, I trust you, Clarita interrupted. Both of you. You're fighting for something I never thought I'd have to defend. My right to live my own life. David turned back to her, and she caught something in his expression that went beyond professional concern. We won't let them take that away from you. Sarah cleared her throat diplomatically. I hate to interrupt, but we need to talk about the media strategy. Media strategy. These cases sometimes attract public attention, especially when they involve allegations of elder abuse. Sarah explained. If we decide to go public with the real story, that this is a financially motivated attack rather than genuine concern for your welfare, it could help generate support for your case. David frowned. That's a double-edged sword. Media attention could also make you a target for more scrutiny, or it could expose the pattern of Bradley's practice and Margaret's financial motives. Sarah countered. Sometimes sunshine is the best disinfectant. Clarita considered this. The academic in her recoiled from the idea of her private life becoming public spectacle, but the pragmatist recognized that public opinion could influence legal outcomes. Let's keep that option open but not pursue it yet, she decided. I'd rather win this case on the merits than in the court of public opinion. David nodded approvingly. Why? But Sarah's right that we should be prepared in case Bradley tries to manipulate media coverage himself. A knock on the conference room door interrupted their strategy session. David's secretary appeared with a concerned expression. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a reporter from the New York Post on the phone. She's asking about the Morrison guardianship case, and wants to know if we have any comment on allegations that Mrs. Morrison has been neglecting her health and safety. The three of them exchanged grim looks. Bradley was already playing the media game. Tell her we have no comment at this time, David instructed, and start a log of all media contacts. We need to track how this story is being shaped. After his secretary left, David turned back to Clarita with an expression that mixed professional determination with personal concern. This is what we were afraid of. Bradley is getting ahead of the narrative, painting you as a vulnerable elder in denial about her condition. Then we need to be smarter and faster, Clarita said, drawing on the strength that had carried her through decades of academic politics and personal challenges. What do we do first? Sarah consulted her timeline on the whiteboard. First, we need to interview all potential witnesses and prepare their testimony. Second, we schedule your neuropsychological evaluation with our expert. Third, we file our response to the petition, including all the evidence we've gathered about Margaret's financial situation and Bradley's pattern of abuse. And fourth, David added, his voice carrying a note of steel, we prepare to expose exactly what this case is really about. Margaret Morrison Thompson is about to learn that destroying an innocent person's life to solve your financial problems has consequences. Clarita felt a surge of something she hadn't experienced in years. The thrill of intellectual combat, the satisfaction of a worthy opponent, the confidence that came from being brilliantly represented. Margaret had chosen the wrong target and underestimated the wrong woman. When do we she asked. David smiled, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Clarita felt genuinely hopeful. We already have. The Chinese takeout containers sat forgotten on David's conference table as the clock on his office wall ticked past 10 p.m. What had begun as a working dinner to prepare for tomorrow's hearing had evolved into something neither Clarita nor David had anticipated. A conversation that transcended the boundaries of attorney and client. I never imagined I'd be sitting in a law office at 72 fighting my own children for the right to live in my own home, Clarita said, absently stirring her cold lo mein with plastic chopsticks. The stress of the day had left her emotionally raw, her usual careful composure worn thin by hours of preparing testimony and reviewing deposition. David looked up from the legal brief he'd been drafting, noting the vulnerability in her voice that she'd kept carefully hidden during their professional discussions. I never imagined I'd be 58 and starting over after a 20-year marriage either. Life has a way of surprising us. The admission hung between them in the quiet office. Outside, Manhattan's lights twinkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows. But inside, the formal distance they'd maintained seemed to be dissolving. Your divorce was recent, Clarita asked gently, recognizing the particular kind of pain that came from rebuilding a life you'd thought was settled. Final 6 months ago. David set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, looking older in the soft lamplight. 20 years of marriage, and it ended not with drama but with the quiet realization that we'd become strangers living in the same house. No affairs, no betrayals. Just two people who'd grown in different directions. Clarita nodded with understanding. Robert and I were lucky. We grew together rather than apart, but I've watched enough colleagues go through what you describe. Sometimes compatibility isn't enough to sustain love. What was he like, Robert? The question was personal, inappropriate for an attorney-client relationship, and Clarita found herself answering anyway. Brilliant. Funny, kind in a way that made everyone around him better. He was a professor too. Medieval history. We met at a faculty mixer and spent our first date arguing about whether Chalker was a feminist or a misogynist. David smiled. Who won? We're still debating it. Even though he's been gone 5 years, I find myself having conversations with him about books, about current events, about the children. Her voice caught slightly. I wonder what he'd think about Margaret's behavior. I think, David said carefully, that any father would be heartbroken to see his daughter treating her mother this way. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of shared understanding settling between them. Both had lost partnerships that had defined decades of their lives. Both were navigating the unexpected challenges of starting over in what society considered their twilight years. Can I ask you something? Clarita said, her academic curiosity overriding her sense of propriety. Why elder law? You could make more money in corporate practice, face less heartbreak. David was quiet for so long that Clarita wondered if she'd overstepped. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the pain of old wounds. My grandmother, Anna Johnson, she was the smartest woman I ever knew, spoke 4 languages, could do complex mathematical calculations in her head, had opinions about everything from politics to poetry. When my grandfather died, she was 78 and perfectly capable of living independently. He stood and moved to the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. My uncle convinced a court that she was becoming difficult and unsafe. He had her declared incompetent based on the testimony of a doctor who'd examined her for 20 minutes. She spent the last 3 years of her life in a nursing home, watching strangers control every aspect of her existence while my uncle sold her house, her furniture, her jewelry, everything she'd spent a lifetime accumulating. She never got it back. She died before we could reverse the guardianship, but not before she made me promise that I'd never let it happen to anyone else, if I could prevent it. David turned back to face her. Every case I take, every client I represent, I'm keeping that promise. Clarita felt something shift in her understanding of the man who'd become her advocate. This wasn't just professional competence, it was personal mission. I'm sorry you lost her that way. I'm sorry you're facing what she faced, and I'm angry that Margaret is putting you through this. His voice carried an edge that suggested his feelings about the case had moved beyond professional concern. Before Clarita could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message. The name on the screen made her heart skip. James, it's my son, she said, showing David the screen. He wants to see me. Alone. David frowned. That could be a trap. If Bradley is coaching the family, James might be wearing a wire, or trying to get you to say something that could be used against you. Clarita read the message again. Mom, I need to see you. There are things you need to know about Margaret's plan. I can't live with this anymore. Or he might be having second thoughts about what they're doing, she said quietly. James was never strong enough to stand up to Margaret, but he's not cruel. If he's reaching out, it's your decision, David said, though his tone suggested he thought it was a bad idea. But if you meet with him, I want you to record the conversation. Legally, in New York, you only need one party's consent to record a conversation you're part of. 20 minutes later, They were sitting in David's car outside Clarita's apartment building, waiting for James to arrive. The recording app on Clarita's phone was activated, and David had briefed her on what questions to ask and what topics to avoid. "Remember," he said quietly, "anything you say to him could potentially be used in court. But anything he tells you about Margaret's planning, her financial situation, or Bradley's instructions, could be crucial to our defense." James appeared at the building entrance at exactly 11 p.m., looking haggard and significantly older than his 45 years. Clarita met him in the lobby, acutely aware of David waiting in the car outside and the phone recording their conversation in her purse. "Mom," James said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted it to go this far." "How far did you think it would go when you agreed to help Margaret lie to the police?" James flinched as if she'd struck him. "She said it would just be a welfare check, that once the doctors confirmed you were fine, she'd back off the nursing home idea. She said she just wanted documentation that you'd been evaluated." "And you believe that?" "I wanted to believe it." James ran his hands through his unkempt hair. "Mom, I've been struggling. The gallery closed. I can't sell my work. I'm 3 months behind on rent. When Margaret said you had plenty of money and could help both of us, she told you I'd help you financially if you helped her prove I was incompetent." "Not exactly. She said that if something happened to you, the inheritance would be split between us, but that if you went into a nursing home and needed care, there might not be anything left." James's voice was barely above a whisper. "She made it sound like we were protecting your assets for the family." Clarita felt a complex mixture of pity and anger toward her son. He'd been manipulated, but he'd also chosen to participate in that manipulation. "James, what exactly is Margaret planning? What does she expect to happen tomorrow?" "She thinks the judge will grant temporary guardianship, based on last night's police report. Bradley told her that once she has legal control, she can move you to a facility in New Jersey that he recommends. He says it's nice, but..." James's voice trailed off. "But what? It's expensive. Really expensive. Margaret would have to sell your apartment to pay for it." The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with devastating clarity. Margaret wasn't just trying to gain control of Clarita's assets. She was planning to liquidate them completely under the guise of paying for care. "There's something else," James continued, his guilt evident in every word. "Bradley has a psychiatrist who's going to evaluate you. Margaret paid him $5,000 for the evaluation. She paid him before he even met." "She said it was a retainer. But Mom, I think she paid him to find you incompetent, regardless of what he actually observes." This was the kind of corruption David had warned her about, but hearing it confirmed by her own son made it feel more real and more dangerous. "James," she said carefully, "would you be willing to tell the truth about this in court tomorrow?" Her son's face crumpled. "Margaret will never forgive me. Her kids, my niece and nephew, they'll grow up thinking I destroyed the family." "The family is already destroyed," Clarita said gently. "Margaret destroyed it when she decided to treat her own mother as a financial opportunity rather than a person deserving respect." They talked for another 10 minutes, James revealing more details about Margaret's planning and Bradley's tactics. When they finally parted, Clarita felt emotionally drained, but strategically hopeful. James might not have the courage to testify against his sister, but his information had given them crucial insight into the opposition's strategy. Back in David's car, they listened to key portions of the recording together. "This is explosive," David said, his excitement evident despite the late hour. "The paid psychiatric evaluation, the premeditated plan to liquidate your assets, the admission that this was financially motivated. This could blow their case apart, but only if James is willing to testify. Even if he isn't, we have the record. In New York, recordings made with one party's consent are admissible in court." Clarita leaned back in the passenger seat, suddenly exhausted. "David, what happens if we lose tomorrow?" "We don't lose," he said with quiet conviction. "We can't lose. But if we do..." David was quiet for a long moment. "If we lose tomorrow, you'd be placed under Margaret's guardianship temporarily. She'd have the authority to move you to a facility, control your finances, make medical decisions. We'd appeal, of course, but appeals take time, and the damage done during that time can be irreversible. The thought of losing her independence, her home, her right to make her own choices, sent a chill through Clarita that had nothing to do with the October night air. "David," she said quietly, "thank you. Not just for being my attorney, but for caring about the outcome beyond your professional obligations." He turned to look at her in the dim light of the car's interior. "Clarita, I need to tell you something, and I'm not sure how appropriate it is given our professional relationship."
What is it?
"I care about you, not just as a client, but as a person. Over the past few days, talking with you, seeing your strength and intelligence and grace under pressure, I find myself thinking about you in ways that go beyond legal advocacy." The admission hung between them in the quiet. Clarita felt her heart rate increase, not from anxiety, but from something she hadn't experienced in years, the flutter of romantic possibility. "David, I know it's complicated," he continued quickly. "I know there are ethical considerations and professional boundaries, but I also know that life is unpredictable, and meaningful connections are rare at any age." Clarita reached over and placed her hand on his, feeling the warmth of his skin, and the slight tremor that suggested he was as nervous about this conversation as she was. "After tomorrow," she said quietly, "after we win this case and Margaret's schemes are exposed, I'd like to have dinner with you, not as attorney and client, but as two people who found something unexpected in the middle of a crisis." David smiled, and even in the dim light, she could see the relief and happiness in his expression. "I'd like that very much." As he walked her to her building entrance, Clarita realized that Margaret's attempt to destroy her life had led to something Margaret could never have anticipated: the possibility of love. At 72, with a legal battle looming and her family in shambles, Clarita Morrison was falling for her attorney. The irony wasn't lost on her. Tomorrow she'd be fighting for her right to independence and autonomy. But tonight, she was discovering that sometimes the best kind of independence includes the freedom to open your heart to someone new. The Manhattan Family Court building loomed gray and imposing in the October morning light as Clarita walked up the stone steps beside David and Sarah. Despite the crisp fall air, her palms were damp with perspiration beneath her carefully chosen navy blue suit, professional, competent, the attire of a woman in full control of her faculties. "Remember," David said quietly, as they approached the metal detectors, "answer only what's asked. Don't elaborate unless I signal you to do so. And no matter what Bradley says about you or your family, maintain your composure. Every reaction will be scrutinized." Courtroom 3B was smaller than Clarita had expected, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that cast everything in harsh relief. Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table with Thomas Bradley, her expression a careful mask of concerned daughter. She'd dressed for the role understated clothing, minimal makeup, tissues prominently placed within reach. James was nowhere to be seen, and Clarita felt a mixture of disappointment and understanding. Her son had chosen his path, even if it led to moral cowardice. Judge Elizabeth Harper entered at exactly 2 p.m., a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair, and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen every possible family tragedy. Her reputation for fairness was legendary, but so was her inclination to err on the side of protecting vulnerable seniors. "This court is now in session," the bailiff announced. "The matter before us is an emergency petition for guardianship in the case of Morrison Thompson versus Morrison." Bradley rose with the polished confidence of a man who'd perfected his performance over dozens of similar cases. His opening statement painted a picture of a loving daughter forced to take desperate measures to protect her declining mother. "Your Honor, this is one of the most difficult situations a family can face. Margaret Morrison Thompson loves her mother deeply, but she can no longer stand by and watch Clarita Morrison endanger herself through poor judgment and cognitive decline." He presented the evidence methodically: the police report from 3 nights ago, photographs of what he claimed was a cluttered and unsafe apartment, testimony about unpaid bills and confusion about dates. The respondent's resistance to assistance, her anger at family intervention, and her denial of obvious safety concerns, are all consistent with mild cognitive impairment progressing toward moderate dementia. Morrison Thompson seeks temporary guardianship, not out of convenience, but out of love and genuine fear for her mother's welfare. When Bradley called Margaret to testify, her performance was Academy Award-worthy. Tears flowed at precisely the right moments as she described her mother's alleged confusion, her own anguish at watching a brilliant woman decline, her desperate fear that something terrible would happen. I found her in the hallway at 3 a.m, Your Honor. She was in her nightgown, and she didn't recognize me at first. She seemed so confused about where she was, what time it was. It broke my heart. Bradley guided her through each alleged incident with practiced skill. The pot on the stove became evidence of dangerous forgetfulness. The missed bills became proof of cognitive decline. Even Clarita's book club was reframed as concerning isolation from family. Has your mother shown resistance to family assistance? Bradley asked. Yes, Margaret said, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. She becomes agitated when we try to help. She accuses us of interfering, of lying about things. It's like she's becoming paranoid, suspicious of the people who love her most. David's cross-examination was surgical in its precision. Ms. Morrison-Thompson, you testified that you found your mother confused in the hallway at 3 a.m. What were you doing in her building at that hour? I couldn't sleep. I was worried about her, so I went to check. You have a key to her apartment? Yes, for emergencies. When did she give you this key? Margaret hesitated for just a moment, long enough for Judge Harper to notice. I've had it for some time, for situations like this. Did you make a copy of her key without her knowledge? What true? That's not. I had her permission. David moved to his evidence table and retrieved a document. This is a statement from the building superintendent indicating that no additional keys were authorized for Mrs. Morrison's apartment. How do you explain that? Bradley objected. But Judge Harper allowed the question. Margaret's composure began to crack under David's relentless questioning about the key, the timing of her visit, the convenient presence of her phone to document the alleged incident. Morrison-Thompson, are you currently facing foreclosure on your Westchester home? That's not relevant to my mother's condition. Please answer the question. Yes, but, and do you have significant credit card debt? My financial situation has nothing to do with my concern for my mother. David pulled out another document. This is a credit report showing over $60,000 in consumer debt. Would gaining control of your mother's substantial assets help resolve your financial difficulties? Margaret's face flushed red. How dare you suggest that I would exploit my own mother for money? Everything I've done has been out of love and concern, but the damage was done. David had planted the seed of financial motivation, and Judge Harper's expression suggested she was considering that possibility seriously. When Dr. Williams took the stand, her testimony was devastating to Margaret's case. She described her examination of Clarita during the police incident, her findings of complete cognitive competence, and her professional opinion that the claimed confusion was inconsistent with her observations. In your medical opinion, doctor, did Ms. Morrison show any signs of dementia or cognitive impairment during your examination?
None whatsoever.
Her memory was excellent, her reasoning was clear, and her emotional responses were entirely appropriate to the situation. If anything, she demonstrated superior cognitive function for her age. Bradley's cross-examination tried to suggest that a single examination couldn't rule out cognitive decline, but Dr. Williams held firm. I've been Mrs. Morrison's physician for over a decade. I've seen no evidence of cognitive deterioration during that entire period. Rose Anderson's testimony provided a character witness perspective that painted Clarita as sharp, engaged, and fully competent. But it was Eleanor Chen, the retired psychiatrist from the book club, whose testimony carried particular weight. I've observed Ms. Morrison in intellectually demanding discussions for over 2 years, Dr. Chen testified. Her analytical abilities, her memory for complex literary concepts, her capacity for nuanced thinking, all are exceptional. Any suggestion of cognitive impairment is simply not supported by observable evidence. The neuropsychological evaluation David had arranged provided scientific backup to the witness testimony. Dr. Rebecca Stern, an independent expert, had subjected Clarita to hours of cognitive testing. Miss Morrison's test results place her in the superior range for cognitive functioning across all measured domains. Dr. Stern testified. Her memory, executive function, language skills and problem-solving abilities are all well above average for her age group. I found no evidence of any cognitive impairment. But the most dramatic moment came when David called James Morrison to the stand. Clarita's heart stopped as her son entered the courtroom. He looked haggard, conflicted, but determined. Margaret's face went white as she realized what was about to happen. "Mr. Morrison," David began gently, "you are the respondent's son and the co-petitioner's brother. Can you tell the court about the events leading up to the incident 3 nights ago?" James's voice was barely audible at first. "Margaret asked me to meet her at Mom's building. She said we needed to document Mom's condition for her own safety. Did you observe your mother in a confused or disoriented state that night?" James was quiet for so long that Judge Harper prompted him to answer. When he finally spoke, his words shattered Margaret's case completely. "No, Mom wasn't confused or disoriented. She was asleep when the police arrived. Margaret had used a key that Mom never gave her to get into the building. The whole thing was staged." The courtroom erupted. Margaret jumped to her feet, shouting at her brother, while Bradley frantically tried to object. Judge Harper's gavel rang out repeatedly as she restored order. "Morrison," David continued when quiet was restored, "are you saying that your sister deliberately misrepresented the facts to the police?" James looked directly at his mother, tears streaming down his face. "Yes, Margaret planned the whole thing. She wanted to create documentation that would support the guardianship petition. She told me it was necessary to protect Mom's assets from nursing home costs. But I realize now that she just wanted control of the money." Margaret's attorney tried damage control during cross-examination, suggesting that James was lying to protect his mother or had been coached. But James's obvious anguish and detailed knowledge of Margaret's planning made his testimony credible. The final blow came when David played the recording of his conversation with James outside Clarita's apartment. Margaret's voice could be heard in the background during one portion, confirming details of the scheme that James had revealed. Bradley's closing argument was a desperate attempt to salvage an unsalvageable case, but the evidence was overwhelming. Not only was Clarita competent, but the petition itself was based on manufactured evidence and financial motivation. David's closing was brief and powerful. "Your Honor, this case represents everything wrong with a system that can be manipulated by those who would exploit our natural desire to protect vulnerable seniors. Clarita Morrison is not vulnerable. She is a victim of a carefully orchestrated scheme by her own daughter to steal her independence, her assets, and her dignity." Judge Harper took only 15 minutes to render her decision. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, this court finds no credible evidence of cognitive impairment or incompetence on the part of Clarita Morrison. The petition for guardianship is denied in its entirety, but she wasn't finished. Furthermore, this court is deeply troubled by evidence suggesting that this petition was based on false information provided to law enforcement and potentially fraudulent testimony. I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of possible perjury and elder abuse charges. Margaret's face went ashen as the implications sank in. Not only had she lost her bid for guardianship, but she now faced potential criminal charges. Additionally, Judge Harper continued, "I am issuing a restraining order prohibiting Margaret Morrison Thompson from having any contact with the respondent for a period of 90 days, pending resolution of the criminal investigation." As court was dismissed, Clarita felt a mixture of triumph and profound sadness. She had won her freedom, but at the cost of any relationship with her daughter. Margaret was let out by court officers, her carefully constructed facade finally completely shattered. James approached his mother hesitantly. "Mom, I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm so sorry. I should have stopped her from the beginning." Clarita looked at her son, weak, manipulated, but ultimately capable of choosing truth over family loyalty. "James, what you did took courage. We have a lot to work through, but I'm proud that you found the strength to tell the truth." Outside the courthouse, David, Sarah and Clarita stood in the October sunshine. The weight of the legal battle finally lifted from their shoulders. "It's over," Sarah said with satisfaction. "Margaret will likely face criminal charges, and there's no chance of any future guardianship petitions being taken seriously." David turned to Clarita with a smile that mixed professional satisfaction with personal joy. "You're free, Clarita, completely free." As they walked down the courthouse steps together, Clarita realized that Margaret's scheme had failed in every possible way. Not only had she not gained control of her mother's assets, but she'd destroyed her own life in the process. The irony was almost Shakespearean in its completeness. But for Clarita, victory felt bittersweet. She had won the battle for her independence, but lost a daughter in the process. Some wounds she knew would never heal. Still, as David's hand found hers as they walked toward their new future together, she realized that endings could also be beginning. At 72, she was starting a new chapter of her life, one where love and justice had indeed bloomed together, proving that it's never too late for either. The quiet corner table at Café Sabarsky felt like a sanctuary after the harsh fluorescent lights and adversarial atmosphere of the courthouse. Clarita sat across from David in the elegant Viennese-style restaurant, the afternoon light filtering through tall windows and casting warm shadows across their faces. It had been David's suggestion to celebrate somewhere beautiful, somewhere that honored the gravity of what they'd just experienced while acknowledging the new possibilities that lay ahead. "I still can't quite believe it's over," Clarita said, her fingers wrapped around a delicate porcelain cup of coffee. The adrenaline from the courtroom victory was finally wearing off, leaving her feeling both exhausted and oddly weightless. David reached across the small table and covered her hand with his. The gesture was gentle, tentative, their first truly personal contact, now that the attorney-client relationship had officially ended with Judge Harper's ruling. "You were magnificent in there," he said quietly. "The way you maintained your dignity while Margaret was performing her concerned daughter act. How you answered Bradley's questions without losing your composure. It was extraordinary." Clarita felt a flutter of something she'd almost forgotten, the pleasure of being seen and appreciated by someone whose opinion mattered. "I had excellent representation, and excellent preparation." Their eyes met across the table, and she saw in his expression the same mixture of relief and possibility that she was feeling. The legal battle that had brought them together was over, but something else was just beginning. "Clarita," David said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that made him seem younger than his 58 years. "I know this is complicated. I know there are ethical considerations about relationships that develop from professional circumstances, but I also know that I haven't felt this way about anyone in a very long time." She studied his face, the kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the slight lines that spoke of both laughter and concern, the gray threading through his dark hair. At 72, she'd thought herself past the age of romantic butterflies, but David Johnson was proving her wrong. "It is complicated," she agreed, "but I learned something about myself during this ordeal. I learned that I'm still capable of taking risks, of fighting for what matters. And David, you matter." He squeezed her hand gently. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that Margaret's attempt to control my life has reminded me how precious freedom is. The freedom to make my own choices, to take my own risks, to open my heart if I choose to." She paused, surprised by her own boldness. "I'm thinking I'd like to see where this leads." David's smile was radiant. "I was hoping you'd say that." They talked for 2 hours, the conversation flowing from the legal victory to more personal topics, books they'd loved, places they'd traveled, dreams they'd put aside, and dreams they were discovering. When David mentioned his passion for hiking and classical music, Clarita found herself imagining shared adventures, quiet evenings, listening to Bach and Beethoven. "There's something I need to tell you," Clarita said as they prepared to leave the cafe. "James tried to call me 3 times during lunch. I haven't answered." David's expression grew serious. "How do you feel about that?" "Conflicted." He chose to tell the truth in the end, which took courage. But he also participated in Margaret's scheme for weeks before his conscience kicked in. She gathered her purse, suddenly feeling the weight of family betrayal all over again. "I don't know if I can trust him again." "You don't have to decide that today," David said gently. Forgiveness is a process, not a moment. As they walked out into the crisp October afternoon, Clarita felt David's hand slip into hers. The simple gesture sent warmth through her entire body, not just physical warmth, but the emotional warmth of connection, of not being alone. Would you like to come up to my apartment? She asked as they approached her building. I promise there are no pots burning on the stove, and all my bills are paid. David laughed, the first genuinely carefree sound she'd heard from him since they'd met. I'd love to see your home. The real version, not Thomas Bradley's twisted interpretation. Clarita's apartment felt different as she unlocked the door and led David inside. The elegant rooms that Margaret had photographed as evidence of decline now seemed to glow with warmth and personality. David moved slowly through the living room, examining the bookshelves, the art on the walls, the comfortable furniture arranged for both solitude and conversation. This is beautiful, he said, running his fingers along the spine of a first-edition Virginia Woolf. It feels like you, intelligent, cultured, deeply sitful. Robert helped choose most of the art, Clarita said, then caught herself. It felt strange to mention her deceased husband while entertaining a man she was falling for, but David's expression remained understanding. He had excellent taste, in art, and in women. They settled on the sofa where Margaret had sat just days earlier, spinning her web of false concern. But with David beside her, the space felt reclaimed, transformed back into a place of warmth rather than manipulation. Clarita, David said, turning to face her more fully, I need you to know that my feelings for you aren't born out of the intensity of the legal situation. It's not adrenaline or proximity or some kind of rescue fantasy. What is it then? It's the way your mind works, the way you approach problems with both intellect and intuition. The grace you've shown under unimaginable pressure. The way you make me want to be better than I am. He paused, seeming to gather courage. I'm falling in love with you, and it terrifies me because I didn't think I was capable of this kind of feeling anymore. Clarita felt her heart racing with the particular intensity that accompanies life-changing moments. David. Her phone rang, interrupting the intimate moment. The caller ID showed Sarah Mitchell's name. I should take this, Clarita said apologetically. Sarah wouldn't call, unless it was important. Clarita, Sarah's voice was tense with excitement and concern. I'm sorry to bother you, but something's happened. A private investigator just left our office. He said he'd been hired by Margaret to investigate both you and David. David's expression hardened as he listened to Clarita's side of the conversation. What kind of investigation? Financial records, personal history, looking for anything that could be used to discredit either of you. The investigator said Margaret paid him $5,000 up front, with a promise of more if he found anything useful. Clarita felt cold dread settling in her stomach. What did he find? That's the thing. He came to warn us instead of reporting to Margaret. Apparently, Margaret tried to get him to fabricate evidence when his actual investigation didn't turn up anything damaging. He got uncomfortable with the assignment and decided to come clean. David took the phone. Sarah, this is David. What exactly was Margaret asking him to fabricate? Financial impropriety on your part, maybe billing irregularities, or inappropriate use of client funds. For Clarita, she wanted him to document evidence of erratic behavior, maybe drinking problems or inappropriate relationships. David's jaw tightened. She was trying to destroy both of our reputations. It gets worse. The PI says Margaret mentioned having backup plans if the guardianship case failed. She's not giving up, David. Even after losing in court, even facing criminal charges, she's still scheming. After they hung up, David and Clarita sat in stunned silence. The victory they'd been celebrating suddenly felt incomplete, fragile. She's not going to stop, Clarita said quietly. Even after everything that happened in court today, Margaret is still trying to destroy my life. David moved closer to her on the sofa, his arm going around her shoulders in a gesture that was both protective and intimate. Then we stop her. Permanently. How? We expose everything. The private investigator, the attempts to fabricate evidence, the pattern of harassment. We make it impossible for her to continue this campaign without facing serious criminal consequences. Clarita leaned into David's embrace, drawing comfort from his strength and determination. This means our relationship will become public. The private investigator, the attempts to discredit us. It's all going to come out. Are you worried about that? Clarita considered the question seriously. A few weeks ago, the thought of her private life becoming public scrutiny would have horrified her. But Margaret's attacks had already stripped away her privacy, her family relationships, her sense of security. What did she have left to lose? I'm not worried, she said finally. I'm tired of living defensively, tired of worrying about what other people think or how they'll judge my choices. Margaret's scheme has had one unintended consequence. It's made me realize how little I care about other people's opinions of my life. David smiled and pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head. In that case, Ms. Morrison, would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow night? Not as attorney and client, not as co-conspirators in legal warfare, but as two people who are falling in love despite the chaos surrounding them. I thought you'd never ask, Clarita said, turning in his arms to face him fully. But David, I need you to understand something. I'm 72 years old. I come with complications, estranged children, legal battles, probably more drama than any rational person would want to deal with. Clarita, David said, his voice tender but firm. I'm 58 years old and recently divorced. I've devoted my career to fighting other people's family battles, which means I understand drama and complications better than most. None of that scares me. What does scare you? The possibility that you might decide I'm not worth the complications I bring to your life. Before she could respond, David leaned forward and kissed her, gently at first, then with increasing passion as she responded. It was a kiss that spoke of new beginnings, of courage in the face of uncertainty, of two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstance. When they finally broke apart, Clarita felt breathless and younger than she had in years. David Johnson, she said, with a smile that would have made her book club friends cheer. You are definitely worth the complication. Outside her windows, Manhattan continued its restless evening dance, indifferent to the small miracle occurring in one Upper West Side apartment. But inside, two people who'd thought their chances for great love had passed, were discovering that the heart doesn't follow timelines or social expectations. Margaret's crusade to control her mother's life had failed spectacularly, but in its failure it had created something Margaret could never have anticipated. A love story that proved some risks are worth taking at any age. As the evening light faded and the city lights began to twinkle, Clarita Morrison and David Johnson sat together on her sofa, planning their future while knowing that Margaret's next move could threaten everything they were building. But for the first time in weeks, neither of them was afraid. They'd survived the worst Margaret could do in a courtroom. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The manila envelope arrived at Clarita's apartment building at 7 in the morning, delivered by a courier who refused to identify the sender. Inside, alongside a stack of photocopied documents, was a note written in Margaret's familiar handwriting. Since you chose your lawyer over your family, you should know what kind of man you're sleeping with. Clarita's hands trembled as she spread the contents across her dining room table. Bank statements showing David's financial struggles during his divorce, credit reports documenting the division of assets that had left him temporarily cash poor. Most damaging of all, copies of what appeared to be romantic emails between David and a woman named Jennifer, emails that suggested an affair during his marriage. Her phone rang as she was studying the documents, David's name appearing on the screen. Good morning. His voice was warm with the intimacy that had developed between them over the past week. How did you sleep, David? Clarita said, her voice strained. I need you to come over. Something's happened. The tone in her voice must have alarmed him because his response was immediate. I'll be right there. 20 minutes later, David sat across from her at the same dining room table where they'd shared takeout Chinese food and fallen in love. His face grew increasingly grim as he examined the documents. Where did these come from? He asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. A courier delivered them this morning. There was a note from Margaret. Clarita handed him the handwritten message, watching his face for any sign of guilt or deception. David read the note, then set it down with a heavy sigh. The financial documents are accurate. My divorce was expensive. Jennifer kept the house, most of our joint investments. I had to take out loans to pay my share of our joint debts. And the emails? David's silence stretched long enough to make Clarita's heart sink. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old shame. Jennifer was a colleague at my previous firm. We worked together on several cases, developed a friendship that became more. The emails are real. Clarita felt something cold settle in her chest. You had an affair. Yes. David met her eyes directly, not flinching from her disappointment. It lasted about 6 months. It was wrong, and it was ultimately the reason my marriage ended. Not because Linda found out, but because I realized I was capable of that kind of betrayal, and it made me question everything about who I thought I was. The admission hung between them like a physical barrier. Clarita stared at the man she'd been falling in love with, trying to reconcile the David she knew, ethical, principled, devoted to protecting vulnerable people, with the David who'd been capable of adultery. Why didn't you tell me? Because I was because I knew it would change how you saw me, because I've spent 3 years trying to become a better man than the one who could hurt someone he'd promised to cherish. Before Clarita could respond, her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something prompted her to answer.
Morrison? This is Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News. We've received some disturbing allegations about your relationship with your attorney, David Johnson. Would you care to comment? Clarita's blood ran cold. I have no comment. We've been told that Ms. Johnson may have been taking advantage of your vulnerable state following your family's concerns about your mental health. Are you aware of his history of extramarital affairs and financial problems? This conversation is over. Clarita hung up, her hands shaking with anger and fear. David was already reaching for his phone. I need to call Sarah. If reporters are calling you, this story is about to go public. Within an hour, Sarah had arrived at Clarita's apartment with grim news. It's worse than we thought, she said, spreading newspapers and printouts from online news sites across the coffee table. Margaret didn't just hire a private investigator. She's orchestrated a full media campaign. The headlines were brutal. Elderly woman's attorney takes advantage during family crisis. Love or exploitation. Lawyer's romance with vulnerable client raises questions. The predatory attorney, how David Johnson seduced a client during her mental health crisis. Each article painted the same picture: a vulnerable elderly woman, possibly suffering from early dementia, being manipulated by an unethical attorney with a history of financial problems and marital infidelity. Margaret was quoted extensively, playing the role of heartbroken daughter, trying to protect her mother from exploitation. She's twisted everything, Clarita said, reading one particularly vicious piece. The guardianship case, my mental state, our relationship. She's made it all sound sinister. David sat heavily in an armchair, his face pale. My law license is in jeopardy. The ethics board will have to investigate these allegations, even if they're false. Sarah was already on her laptop typing furiously. Thomas Bradley has filed a complaint with the New York State Bar, alleging that David engaged in sexual misconduct with a vulnerable client. He's claiming that your relationship began during the legal representation, and that David took advantage of your alleged diminished capacity. But that's not what happened, Clarita protested. I was never diminished, and our personal relationship didn't begin until after the case was resolved. The truth doesn't matter if the narrative is compelling enough, Sarah said grimly. Margaret has created a story that fits perfectly with public fears about elder abuse and legal exploitation. Even if we prove it's false, the damage to both your reputations could be permanent. David stood and moved to the window, staring out at the Manhattan street below. Maybe I should withdraw from any further legal representation. Distance myself from the situation to minimize the damage to you. Absolutely not, Clarita said with fierce determination. That's exactly what Margaret wants, to isolate me,
to make me doubt the people who care about me. I won't let her manipulate me into pushing away the best thing that's happened to me in years. But even as she spoke the words, Clarita could feel doubt creeping in. Was she being naive? Had David's feelings for her been genuine? Or had she been vulnerable in ways she hadn't recognized? Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. She read it quickly, then looked up with an expression that mixed hope with trepidation. That was the private investigator Margaret hired, the one who came to warn us yesterday. He says he has recordings of his conversations with Margaret that could expose her entire scheme. An hour later, they sat in a coffee shop in Midtown with Frank Castellano, a grizzled private investigator in his 60s, who looked like he'd seen every possible variation of human duplicity. "Lady hired me 3 weeks ago," he said, his gravelly voice carrying traces of a Brooklyn accent. "Standard background check," she said. "Look into her mother's new lawyer. Make sure he was legit." But then the requests got weird. He pulled out a small digital recorder and placed it on the table between them. "She wanted me to find dirt that didn't exist. When I told her your boy here was clean, good reputation, solid practice, the affair was years ago, and didn't involve clients, she asked me to get creative." "Creative how?" David asked. "Make up billing irregularities. Suggest you'd been drinking heavily. Find women willing to say you'd made inappropriate advances." Castellano's expression was disgusting. "I've done a lot of questionable things in my career, but I don't fabricate evidence for custody battles." He pressed play on the recorder. Margaret's voice filled the space between them, clear and unmistakable. "I don't care what you actually found, Frank. I need something that makes him look predatory. Make up client complaints if you have to. Create billing records that show he's stealing from elderly clients, whatever it takes." "Ma'am, that's fraud. I could lose my license." "I'll pay you an extra $10,000 if you give me what I need to destroy both of them." The recording continued for several more minutes, with Margaret becoming increasingly explicit about her willingness to commit perjury and fraud to achieve her goal. "There's more," Castellano said, ejecting the first recording and inserting another. "This is from yesterday, after she found out I wouldn't play ball." Margaret's voice was harder now, desperate. "Fine. If you won't help me, I'll find someone who. But Frank, if you even think about warning them, I'll make sure you never work in this city again." "Is that a threat, lady?" "It's a promise." Sarah was already pulling out her phone. "We need to get this to the district attorney immediately. This is evidence of conspiracy, attempted fraud, witness tampering, and extortion," David added. "Margaret just committed at least 4 felonies on tape." But Castellano held up a warning hand. "Before you celebrate, you should know she's got other investigators working. Guys who aren't as ethical as me." The story that broke this morning. That was just the opening shot. She's planning to release more damaging information over the next few days. "What kind of information?" Clarita asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Photos of you two together, taken with telephoto lenses. Your building's doorman talking about David staying overnight. Financial records suggesting he's been billing excessive hours to your case." Castellano's expression was sympathetic but grim. "She's building toward a climax, something that will destroy both of your reputations permanently." David reached across the table and took Clarita's hand. "We fight back. We expose Margaret's crimes and prove that everything she's saying is fabricated." "David," Clarita said quietly, "your career, your reputation is our relationship worth risking everything you've worked for." His answer was immediate and unwavering. "You are worth everything, Clarita. But more than that, letting Margaret win would mean that lying and manipulation triumph over truth and justice. I became a lawyer to prevent exactly this kind of abuse." Sarah was studying the timeline on her phone. "We have maybe 24 hours before Margaret's next wave of attack. We need to get ahead of this story, expose her scheme, before she can do more damage." Castellano stood to leave, but turned back with a final piece of advice. "Lady's desperate now. Desperate people do dangerous things. Watch your back." After he left, the 3 of them sat in the coffee shop, planning their counterattack while knowing that Margaret was somewhere across the city, orchestrating their destruction with the same methodical precision she'd brought to the guardianship case. "Sarah," David said finally, "call every reporter who covered the story this morning. Tell them we'll hold a press conference tomorrow at noon. Full disclosure. The recordings, the evidence of Margaret's fraud, everything. Are you sure? Sarah asked. Once we go public, there's no controlling the narrative. Clarita squeezed David's hand. We've been fighting defensively since this started. It's time to go on the offensive. As they walked back toward Clarita's apartment, past newsstands displaying headlines about their alleged misconduct, Clarita realized that Margaret's campaign had accomplished something unintended. Instead of driving her and David apart, it had forced them to choose each other completely and publicly. David, she said as they reached her building, whatever happens tomorrow, whatever Margaret throws at us next, I want you to know that I love you. Not because you rescued me from her schemes, not because I'm grateful for your legal help, but because you're a good man who's shown me that it's never too late for a grand love story. David stopped walking and turned to face her full. Clarita Morrison, you are the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever known. If our love story requires fighting Margaret's lies and manipulation, then that's what we'll do. Together. As they entered her building, neither of them noticed the photographer across the street, capturing their embrace with a telephoto lens. Margaret's next attack was already in motion, and by tomorrow their private moment of connection would be front-page news. But for now, they had each other, they had the truth, and they had evidence that could expose Margaret's crimes. The battle for their reputations and their future was far from over, but they were no longer fighting defensively. The gloves were coming off. The press conference room at David's law firm was packed beyond capacity at noon the following day. Reporters, cameras, and legal colleagues filled every available space as Clarita and David sat at a long table flanked by Sarah and a mountain of evidence that would either vindicate them or complete their destruction. But the morning had brought an unexpected twist that changed everything. At 8 a.m., Thomas Bradley had been arrested at his office by FBI agents investigating financial crime. The charges were staggering: embezzlement, money laundering, conspiracy to defraud elderly clients, and wire fraud involving millions of dollars stolen from guardianship estates over the past 5 years. Sarah had received the call just as they were reviewing their press conference strategy. It's over, she'd said, her voice filled with amazement. Bradley's entire operation has collapsed. The FBI has been investigating him for months, and Margaret's case was just the final piece of evidence they needed. Now, as David stood to address the packed room, Clarita felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness. Justice was about to be served, but the cost in family relationships would be permanent. Ladies and gentlemen, David began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years fighting for truth in courtrooms. We called this press conference to address the malicious and false allegations that have been made against Mrs. Clarita Morrison and myself. However, this morning's developments have made our situation much clearer. He gestured to Sarah, who distributed copies of the FBI's press release about Bradley's arrest to the assembled reporters. Thomas Bradley, the attorney who orchestrated the false guardianship case against Mrs. Morrison, was arrested this morning on federal charges related to a massive elder abuse scheme. Mrs. Morrison's case wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of criminal behavior that has victimized dozens of elderly people across New York State. The room erupted with questions, but David held up a hand for silence. More relevant to the false allegations made against us, we have evidence that Margaret Morrison Thompson not only lied about her mother's mental condition, but actively participated in a conspiracy to fabricate evidence against both Mrs. Morrison and myself. Sarah activated a large screen at the front of the room, displaying transcripts of the recorded conversations with the private investigator. As the reporters read Margaret's own words describing her willingness to commit fraud and perjury, the room grew quiet. These recordings, David continued, demonstrate that every allegation made against Miss Morrison's competency and against my professional conduct was part of a deliberate scheme motivated by financial desperation and enabled by a corrupt attorney. Clarita rose from her seat, drawing on the same composure that had served her well during decades of teaching. I'd like to address the personal allegations that have been made about my relationship with Mr. Johnson. Her voice was clear and strong as she looked directly into the television cameras. At 72 years old, I am fully capable of making my own decisions about my personal relationship. The suggestion that I am somehow vulnerable or incapable of informed consent is not only false, but insulting to every senior citizen who values their autonomy and dignity. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. My daughter's attempts to have me declared incompetent failed because I am competent. Her attempts to destroy my reputation and that of the man I love have failed because the truth is stronger than lies. The phrase "the man I love" sent a ripple through the room. Clarita had just publicly declared her feelings for David, staking her reputation on their relationship. Mr. Johnson and I began our personal relationship only after the legal case was concluded, and our attorney-client relationship had ended. Any suggestion otherwise is false and defamatory. David moved to stand beside her, a gesture of solidarity that the cameras captured from every angle. I want to address the allegations about my past. Yes, I had an extramarital affair that ended my previous marriage. It was wrong, and I've spent years trying to become a better man because of that failure. His honesty was stark, vulnerable in a way that made several reporters lean forward. But that personal failing has no bearing on my professional conduct or my relationship with Mrs. Morrison. The suggestion that I would exploit a vulnerable client is not only false, but contradicts everything I've dedicated my career to achieving. Sarah took over, presenting the technical evidence with prosecutorial precision. Bank records showing that David had never overbilled Clarita's case, medical evaluations, proving her complete mental competency, testimony from colleagues, attesting to David's ethical standards. But the most damning evidence, Sarah said, is what happened when Margaret Morrison Thompson realized her schemes were failing. The screen displayed a new set of documents, financial records showing payments from Margaret to multiple private investigators, emails discussing plans to fabricate evidence, and most shocking of all, a recorded phone call between Margaret and a man offering to testify falsely about David's alleged misconduct in exchange for payment. Mrs. Morrison Thompson didn't just lie about her mother's condition, Sarah explained. She attempted to suborn perjury, tamper with witnesses, and commit fraud on multiple levels. These are serious federal crimes, and we expect charges to be filed within days. The questions from reporters came fast and intense. How long had the FBI been investigating Bradley? What would happen to the other victims of his scheme? Were Margaret and David's relationship genuine, or had it developed during the legal case? David and Clarita answered honestly, their responses consistent and credible. But it was Clarita's final statement that dominated the evening news coverage. My daughter chose to see me as an obstacle to her financial security, rather than as a person deserving love and respect. That choice has cost her everything. Her freedom, her family, her integrity. I hope someday she'll understand that the mother she tried to destroy was the same mother who would have helped her if she'd simply asked. After the press conference, they returned to Clarita's apartment to find James waiting in the lobby. He looked haggard, older than his 45 years, but determined. "Mom," he said, as they approached. "I know I don't have the right to ask, but can we talk?" Clarita studied her son's face, seeing genuine remorse mixed with exhaustion. "All right," but David stayed. They went upstairs to the living room, where so much of this drama had played out. James sat on the edge of the sofa, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Margaret's been arrested," he said without preamble. FBI agents came to her house this morning. They have evidence that she paid someone to lie about David, that she was planning to fabricate evidence, that she was working with Bradley to steal money from your estate. "How do you know all this?" "Because they questioned me too, as a potential co-conspirator." James's voice broke slightly. "Mom, I could have gone to prison for what I did. The only reason I'm not under arrest is because I cooperated with the investigation, and because my testimony helped expose the bigger scheme." Clarita felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that her son wouldn't face criminal charges, anger at his initial participation, sadness at how thoroughly Margaret had destroyed their family. "James," David said gently, "what Margaret was planning goes far beyond what you knew about. She was willing to commit serious felonies to gain control of your mother's assets. I know that now, but I should have known it then. I should have stopped her when she first suggested the guardianship idea." James looked directly at his mother. "I was weak, and I was scared about my financial situation, and I let those fears make me complicit in hurting you. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I'm just asking you to know that I'm sorry." Clarita sat quietly for a long moment, processing not just James's words but the events of the past weeks. Her family had been destroyed, but she'd found love. Her daughter faced prison, but her own freedom was secure. The cost of Margaret's greed had been enormous, but it had also revealed truths that might otherwise have remained hidden. "James," she said finally, "forgiveness isn't something you earn or deserve. It's something you choose to give or withhold. I'm not ready to forgive you yet, but I'm not ready to give up on you either." Her son's eyes filled with tears. "What does that mean?" "It means we start over, slowly. You've made terrible choices, but you also chose to tell the truth when it mattered most. That has to count for something." David squeezed Clarita's hand, a gesture of support that James noticed and seemed to accept. "Mom," James said hesitantly, "are you happy with him? I mean." Clarita looked at David, seeing in his face the love and respect that had grown between them through the crucible of Margaret's attack. "Yes, James. I'm happy in a way I never thought I'd be again." "Then I'm glad. You deserve happiness after everything Margaret put you through." After James left, Clarita and David sat together on the sofa, watching the evening news coverage of the day's event. Every major network was covering the story, not as a scandal about an inappropriate relationship, but as an elder abuse case that had exposed a massive criminal conspiracy. "It's really over," Clarita said, still hardly believing it. "Margaret's schemes, Bradley's corruption, the threats to both our reputations, it's all finished." "Not quite," David said, pulling her closer to him. "We still have to decide what comes next for us." Clarita turned to face him fully. "What do you want to come next?" "I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to share books and music and long conversations. I want to travel with you, laugh with you, grow old with you, though you're doing a beautiful job of that already." She laughed at his gentle teasing. "David Johnson, are you proposing to me?" "Actually," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "I am." The ring was simple, elegant, a single diamond set in platinum that caught the light from her reading lamp. "Clarita Morrison, will you marry me? Will you take the risk of building a new life with a man who comes with his own complications, but loves you more than he ever thought possible?" Clarita looked at the ring, at David's hopeful face, at the apartment around them that had been both sanctuary and battlefield. Margaret's attempt to control her life had freed her to make the most important choice of her later years. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it." As David slipped the ring onto her finger, Clarita realized that Margaret's greatest failure wasn't legal or criminal. It was imaginative. Margaret had been unable to conceive of a world where a 72-year-old woman could still have adventures, still take risks, still find great love. That failure of imagination had cost Margaret everything. But for Clarita, it had opened the door to possibilities she'd thought were behind her forever. Outside her windows, Manhattan sparkled with evening lights, indifferent to the small miracle of two people choosing love over fear, hope over cynicism. But inside apartment 12B, Clarita Morrison and David Johnson were beginning the rest of their lives together, having learned that it's never too late for either justice or love to bloom. 6 months after the courthouse victory, Clarita Morrison Johnson stood in the kitchen of the brownstone she and David had purchased together in Greenwich Village, arranging flowers for their dinner party. The move from her Upper West Side apartment had been David's idea, a fresh start in a space that belonged to both of them, unmarked by the trauma of Margaret's scheme. "The guests will be here in an hour," David called from the living room, where he was arranging chairs around their combined book collections. "Are you nervous about your first reading?" Clarita smiled, touching the advance copy of her memoir that sat on the counter. "Elder Abuse and the Fight for Dignity," a personal account, would be published next month, with proceeds going to a legal aid fund Sarah had helped establish. "Not nervous," she said, joining him. Excited. The doorbell rang, and Rose Anderson entered with her characteristic energy, carrying a bottle of wine and immediate opinions. "This place is perfect for you two," she announced, surveying the warm, book-filled rooms. "Much better than that sterile apartment where all the drama happened." Williams arrived next, followed by Sarah Mitchell, who'd been promoted to partner after her brilliant work on Clarita's case and the subsequent elder abuse legislation they drafted together. James was the last to arrive, still tentative in his rebuilt relationship with his mother, but gradually earning back trust through consistent honesty and support. He carried a small canvas, one of his paintings that had finally begun selling after a gallery noticed his work. "Any word about Margaret?" Rose asked as they gathered around the dinner table. 18 months, David said quietly. "She pled guilty to conspiracy and fraud charges. She'll be eligible for parole in 12 months. The room fell silent for a moment. Despite everything, Margaret's downfall brought Clarita no joy, only sadness for opportunities lost and relationships destroyed. "I write to her," Clarita said simply. "She doesn't write back, but I want her to know that forgiveness is possible when she's ready for it." Sarah raised her wine glass. To Clarita, who proved that fighting back against injustice can lead to unexpected joy. "To love at any age," David added, his hand finding Clarita. As the evening progressed, filled with laughter and passionate discussions about books and current events, Clarita marveled at how her chosen family had grown. The legal battle that was meant to isolate her had instead surrounded her with people who valued her mind, respected her choices, and celebrated her happiness. Later, as David helped clear dishes, James approached his mother. "Mom, I'm proud of you. The book, the advocacy work, the way you've built this new life. It's inspiring." "Thank you, James. That means more than you know." After everyone left, Clarita and David sat together on their sofa, her head on his shoulder, watching the flames dance in their fireplace. "Any regret?" David asked softly. Clarita considered the question, thinking of all she'd lost and gained. "None," she said finally. "Margaret tried to write my ending, but instead she gave me a new beginning." Outside, Greenwich Village hummed with life, but inside their brownstone, two people who'd found each other in the midst of betrayal were building a love story that proved it's never too late for happiness. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.